Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. How would you react if your HOA mailed you violation photos that could only be taken from 15 feet inside your yard? Because that's what happened to me, and when I asked how they got them, the president basically told me to stop asking. That's when I stopped arguing and started recording. We bought our house about 3 years ago. The property is set up kind of unusually. Our house sits way back from the street with this long gravel driveway winding through some trees to get to the main road. The people who lived here before us had put in these huge hedges all around the edges of the lot, so you can't really see the house from anywhere except right at the front gate. It felt like having our own private little world, which is exactly what we were looking for. The house came with about an acre of land, most of it behind the house where you can't see it from anywhere except our back windows. We've got trees everywhere, thick bushes along the fence line, and what used to be a pretty neglected backyard that we've been slowly fixing up over the past few years. I work in IT, but photography has always been my hobby. I've got a pretty good eye for angles, lighting, and all that technical stuff. My wife jokes that I can spot a photoshopped image from a mile away, and she's probably right. This background detail becomes important later in my story. Our HOA is pretty typical for a suburban neighborhood. Monthly dues of $150, rules about lawn height, paint colors, and all the usual stuff. The board consists of 5 people, but really it's run by one woman who I'll just call the president. She's been in charge for about 6 years now, and from what I've heard from neighbors, she takes the job very seriously. Maybe too seriously. I've always been what you'd call a model homeowner. Pay my dues on time, keep my grass cut, never had a single violation. My wife and I are pretty quiet people. We wave to neighbors, but mostly keep to ourselves. We follow the rules, stay out of drama, and just want to enjoy our little piece of paradise. That's why what happened next caught me completely off guard. It was a Tuesday morning when I found the envelope stuck to my front door. Official HOA letterhead, which already made my stomach drop a little. I figured maybe they were announcing a board meeting or asking for volunteers for the annual cleanup day. Instead, I opened it to find a formal cease and desist notice. The violation was for what they called an unauthorized structure and non-approved landscaping in my backyard. According to the notice, I had 10 days to remove a small storage shed and replant a vegetable garden that was apparently not in compliance with community standards. Now this shed has been there since before we bought the house. It's maybe 6 by 8 feet, tucked into the back corner of our yard behind some fruit trees. The previous owners used it for garden tools, and so do we. As for the vegetable garden, my wife started that last spring. We grow tomatoes, peppers, herbs, nothing crazy. It's maybe 10 by 15 feet of raised beds that we built with cedar boards. But here's what really got my attention. Attached to the violation notice were 3 high-resolution photos showing both the shed and the garden from different angles. I stared at these photos for a good 5 minutes, and something felt wrong. See, because of my photography background, I have a pretty good understanding of perspective, focal length, and positioning. These photos were taken with what looked like a decent camera, probably a DSLR based on the image quality. The first photo showed the side of the shed that faces east. The second showed the garden from the south. The third was a wider shot that included both the shed and garden. I walked out to my backyard and tried to figure out where these photos could have been taken from. The shed sits in the back corner of my property, probably about 200 feet from the street and completely blocked by trees and hedges. To get a clear shot of the east side of the shed, you'd need to be standing inside my property line. I grabbed my own camera and tried to recreate the angles. From the street, even with a telephoto lens, there's no way to see the shed because of all the vegetation. From my neighbor's yard to the east, maybe you could get a glimpse of the roof, but not the detailed side view shown in the violation photos. The garden photos were even more suspicious. The shot showing the south side of the raised beds could only be taken from inside my yard, probably about 15 feet from my back fence. There's a big oak tree that would block any view from outside the property. I spent about an hour that morning walking around the perimeter of my land trying to figure out if there was any possible public vantage point where these photos could have been taken legally. There wasn't. The shadows in the photos also told a story. Based on the angle and length of the shadows, these pictures were taken around midday, probably between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. The depth of field suggested the photographer was fairly close to the subjects, maybe 10 to 20 feet away, but the real smoking gun was in the third photo. In the background, you could see the corner of my back patio and the sliding door that leads into our kitchen. To get that angle, someone would have had to be standing right in the middle of my flower beds. I felt this cold feeling in my stomach. Someone had been on my property without permission, walking around my backyard, taking photos to build a case against me. Instead of calling the HOA right away and going off on them, I decided to take a more measured approach. My dad always taught me that when someone does something questionable, it's better to give them a chance to explain themselves before assuming the worst. I sat down at my computer and wrote a polite, professional email to the HOA management company. The email basically said I had received the violation notice, and while I understood their concerns, I was puzzled about how the photographic evidence had been obtained. I asked them to confirm who had taken the photos and from which public area they had been captured, since I couldn't figure out any legal vantage point where these particular angles would be possible. I kept the tone friendly and confused rather than accusatory. Something like, "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, but I just want to make sure I understand the process correctly for future reference." I sent the email on Tuesday afternoon and expected to hear back within a few days. Instead, I got a response the very next morning, and the tone was nothing like what I expected. The email came directly from the HOA president herself, not the management company. She basically said that the source of the photographic evidence was irrelevant and that I needed to focus on correcting the violations rather than questioning their investigative methods. She went on to explain that the community standards existed to maintain property values for everyone, and that unauthorized structures and inappropriate landscaping affected the entire neighborhood. The email ended with a reminder that failure to comply within the 10-day deadline would result in daily fines of $100 until the violations were corrected. The whole tone was dismissive and a little condescending, like I was some kind of troublemaker for asking a simple question about their evidence. This really bothered me. I wasn't trying to get out of anything or cause problems. If there was actually a legitimate violation, I would have dealt with it. But the fact that they completely avoided answering my question about how the photos were taken made me think I was right to be suspicious. That evening, I told my wife about the whole situation. She was just as confused as I was. We walked out to the backyard together, and I showed her the angles from the photos. She immediately saw what I meant about the impossible vantage points. My wife suggested we check our home security cameras to see if we could spot anyone on the property recently. We have a pretty basic system with cameras covering the driveway in front of the house, but nothing in the backyard since we never thought we'd need it. We spent about an hour going through footage from the past 2 weeks, but didn't see anything unusual. Our cameras have some blind spots, though, especially around the sides and back of the house. But then my wife had a good idea. She suggested we walk around the backyard carefully to see if we could find any evidence that someone had been back there recently. It was getting close to dark, but we grabbed flashlights and started looking around the area where the photos must have been taken from. Near the flower beds behind the shed, my wife noticed something that made us both freeze. There were footprints in the mulch. Now, neither of us had been in that particular area recently. The mulch was fresh, maybe 2 weeks old, and we could clearly see the outline of shoe treads in several spots. The prints led from the back fence line toward the shed and then over to the garden area. Following the trail with our flashlights, we found something even better. Sitting in the grass near the fence was a black lens cap. It was partially hidden under some leaves, like someone had dropped it and not noticed. I picked it up and examined it with my flashlight. It was for a Canon DSLR lens, probably a 50mm based on the size and threading. There was even a serial number etched into the plastic. My wife and I looked at each other, and I think we both realized this was way more serious than just an HOA violation dispute. Someone had definitely been on our property without permission, and we now had physical evidence. The next morning, I took detailed photos of the footprints and the lens cap from multiple angles. I also measured the distance from the fence to where the violation photos must have been taken, which confirmed my estimate of about 15 to 20 feet inside our property line. I was starting to get angry, but I also realized this might be an opportunity. If the HOA president was willing to trespass on my property to find violations, she was probably willing to do it again. And if I could catch her in the act, I'd have a much stronger case. I started researching property law and trespassing statutes. In our state, entering someone's private property without permission is a misdemeanor, even if you're just taking photos. The penalties get more serious if you move or disturb anything on the property. I also looked up our HOA's governing documents, which I probably should have read more carefully when we bought the house. Buried in the fine print was an interesting clause about evidence collection. It stated that any evidence used in violation proceedings must be obtained through legal means and cannot violate homeowner privacy rights. This gave me an idea for what I started thinking of as my insurance policy. I decided to set up a trap. First, I ordered some trail cameras online. These are the kind hunters use with motion sensors and night vision capabilities. They're designed to be hidden and can record for weeks on battery power. While I waited for the cameras to arrive, I started working on what I called my honey pot. I built a new raised bed for herbs right next to the existing vegetable garden, making it very obvious and visible from the back fence line. I used bright white cedar boards and planted it with perfectly legal herbs like basil and oregano. The idea was to create something that looked like it might be a violation to someone who didn't know the HOA rules very well, which would hopefully draw the president back for more photos. When the trail cameras arrived, I spent a Saturday afternoon setting them up in strategic locations around the backyard. I placed them high up in trees where they wouldn't be easily spotted, with overlapping fields of view covering all the areas where someone would need to stand to photograph the shed and gardens. I made sure to test the motion sensors and adjusted the sensitivity so they would trigger on human-sized movement, but not every squirrel or bird. The cameras were set to record both video and still images with timestamps. Now I just had to wait. I didn't have to wait long. 4 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon around noon, I got motion alerts on my phone from 2 of the trail cameras. I was at work when it happened, but I could access the camera feeds remotely through an app. My heart started racing as I watched the footage. At 12:17 p.m., a woman in dark clothing climbed over the back fence and dropped into my yard. Even through the grainy trail camera footage, I could tell it was the HOA president. I'd seen her at a few community meetings over the years. The video showed her walking directly to the herb garden I'd built as bait. She took out what looked like a professional camera and started taking photos from multiple angles. She spent about 5 minutes documenting the new raised bed, then moved over to photograph the existing vegetable garden and storage shed. But then she did something that shocked me. She walked over to a large potted plant that my wife keeps near the back patio and physically moved it about 3 feet to get a clearer shot of the garden. She also appeared to test the handle on our back sliding door, though it was locked. The whole trespassing incident lasted about 15 minutes. She took dozens of photos, moved our property around, and even walked up onto our back deck to peer through windows. When she was finished, she climbed back over the fence and disappeared. I sat in my office staring at my phone screen, replaying the footage. This wasn't just about taking photos anymore. She had moved our property and tried to look into our house. In our state, that crosses the line from simple trespassing into potentially burglary-related charges. But instead of calling the police right away, I decided to be strategic about this. If I played my cards right, I could turn this whole situation completely around. That evening, I called the non-emergency police line and reported a suspicious person on my property. I didn't mention anything about the HOA or that I knew who it was. I just said our security cameras had captured someone trespassing in our backyard, moving our property around and trying door handles. An officer came out to take a report. I showed him the trail camera footage and gave him copies on a flash drive. He seemed pretty concerned about the attempted door check and said they'd follow up if it happened again. The important thing was that now there was an official police report documenting the trespassing with the date and timestamp matching my camera footage. 2 days later, I received another HOA violation notice in the mail. This one was for my new herb garden, claiming it violated setback requirements and wasn't properly approved through the Architectural Review Committee. Attached were new photos, including several that clearly showed the herb garden from angles that would be impossible to achieve from outside my property. One photo was taken from so close that you could read the plant markers I'd stuck in the soil. I almost laughed when I saw them. She'd walked right into my trap and given me even more evidence of trespassing, but I still wasn't ready to play my hand. The violation notice said I had 10 days to remove the herb garden and that my case would be reviewed at the next HOA board meeting if I didn't comply. Perfect. A board meeting would give me the perfect stage for what I had planned. I spent the next week preparing my presentation. I researched property surveying and had a professional surveyor come out to create an official map of my property boundaries. I also had a friend who works in digital forensics help me analyze the metadata from the violation photos to determine exactly when and from where they were taken. The surveyor's report confirmed what I already knew. The violation photos were taken from positions that were clearly inside my private property, some as much as 25 feet past the boundary line. The metadata analysis was even more damning. The photos had been taken with a Canon DSLR camera using a 50mm lens, exactly matching the lens cap I'd found in my yard. The timestamps showed they were taken at 12:19 p.m. and 12:23 p.m. on the same Wednesday when I'd captured the trespassing on video. I also did some research on the HOA president herself. Through public records and social media, I found out she was actually a retired real estate agent who apparently took great pride in her role as community guardian. Her social media posts were full of complaints about neighbors not maintaining their properties properly and photos of various violations she'd reported around the neighborhood. In one post from a few months earlier, she'd actually bragged about her investigative photography skills and how she was able to document violations that other board members missed. I made copies of everything. The survey report, the metadata analysis, screenshots of her social media posts, the police report, and of course the trail camera footage showing her trespassing on my property. The night before the HOA board meeting, I couldn't sleep. My wife kept asking if I was sure I wanted to go through with this. She was worried that making enemies with the HOA board might make our lives difficult in the long run. But I felt like this was about more than just my specific violation. If the president was willing to trespass on my property to find things to complain about, she was probably doing it to other neighbors too. Someone needed to stand up to this behavior. The board meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening. When I arrived, there were maybe 20 other residents there, which was pretty typical for these meetings. Most people only show up when there's drama or when they're personally affected by something. The president sat at a table in front with the other 4 board members. She had a folder in front of her that I assumed contained my violation case. The meeting started with routine business, budget updates, discussion of a new playground installation, that sort of thing. My case was listed under violation hearings near the end of the agenda. When they finally called my name, I walked up to the front and took a seat at the table facing the board. The president opened her folder and started going through my violations with this very serious official tone. She explained that I had multiple unauthorized structures and landscaping violations that were affecting neighborhood property values. She said the board had received complaints from neighbors about the appearance of my backyard, though she didn't specify which neighbors. Then she started showing the violation photos on a big screen, going through each one and explaining what rules I was supposedly breaking. The storage shed was apparently too large and in the wrong location according to current standards. The vegetable garden violated setback requirements. The new herb garden hadn't been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. She was very thorough, very professional, and very confident. She clearly expected this to be a routine case where I'd either agree to fix the violations or accept the fines. When she finished her presentation, she asked if I had any questions or wanted to respond to the allegations. I stood up and thanked the board for their time. Then I said I'd prepared a brief presentation of my own that I thought would help clarify the situation. I started by showing the professional property survey I'd commissioned. I explained that according to this official survey, my shed and gardens were well within my property boundaries and didn't violate any setback requirements. A couple of the board members looked confused and started asking questions about where exactly my property line was. The president interrupted and said that the survey wasn't relevant because the violations were about community standards, not property boundaries. That's when I moved to my next slide. I showed the metadata analysis of the violation photos, explaining that digital cameras embed information about when and where photos are taken. I walked through the technical details about focal length and positioning, explaining that these photos could only have been taken from inside my private property. The room got very quiet. I could see some of the neighbors in the audience starting to whisper to each other. The president's face was getting red, and she said that the source of the evidence wasn't important and that I needed to focus on correcting the actual violations. That's when I played the video. I'd brought a laptop and had it connected to the same screen they'd used for the violation photos. I started the trail camera footage from the Wednesday afternoon when she'd trespassed on my property. The video quality was surprisingly clear. You could clearly see her climbing over my fence, walking around my backyard, photographing everything, moving my potted plant, and trying my back door handle. The timestamp on the video matched perfectly with the metadata from the violation photos she'd just presented. The room was completely silent. A few of the neighbors had their phones out and were recording my presentation. One of the other board members asked if that was really the president in the video. I said I couldn't be completely certain from the video quality, but the timing and location matched perfectly with when the violation photos were taken. Then I showed them the lens cap I'd found in my yard, along with photos of the footprints in my mulch. At this point, the president stood up and said the meeting needed to move on to other business. She said my violation case would be reviewed privately by the board and I'd receive their decision in writing. But I wasn't finished yet. I pulled out a copy of our HOA's governing documents and read the section about evidence collection. The part that says any evidence used in violation proceedings must be obtained through legal means and cannot violate homeowner privacy rights. I explained that since the violation photos were obtained through trespassing, they were inadmissible under the HOA's own rules. Then I read the section about board member conduct, which requires board members to act ethically and within the law when performing HOA duties. Finally, I mentioned that I'd filed a police report about the trespassing incident and provided them with a copy of the report number. The president was furious at this point. She said I was making false accusations and trying to distract from my own violations. She threatened to sue me for defamation if I continued spreading lies about her. That's when one of the other board members, an older guy who'd been pretty quiet during the meeting, asked to see the video footage again. After watching it a second time, he asked the president directly if she had been on my property without permission to take violation photos. She hemmed and hawed for a minute, then finally admitted that she had entered my backyard to document violations, but said it was within her authority as HOA president to investigate complaints. The same board member asked her to show him in the HOA documents where it says the president has the authority to trespass on private property. She couldn't because obviously that authority doesn't exist. At this point, the meeting was getting pretty heated. Some of the neighbors in the audience were asking questions about whether their properties had been investigated the same way. Others were demanding to know if the board had authorized this kind of investigation. The president kept insisting that she was just doing her job and protecting property values for everyone. She said homeowners who follow the rules shouldn't have anything to worry about. That's when I dropped my final bomb. I explained that under state law, what she'd done constituted criminal trespassing, and that moving my potted plant and trying my door handle could potentially be charged as attempted burglary. I said that while I didn't want to pursue criminal charges, I also couldn't allow this kind of behavior to continue against myself or other homeowners. Then I presented my proposed resolution. First, all violations against my property would be dropped immediately since the evidence was obtained illegally. Second, the HOA would pay for a privacy fence along my back property line to prevent future trespassing. Third, the board would adopt new policies requiring all evidence collection to be done from public areas only, with no entry onto private property without explicit written permission. And fourth, I wanted the president to resign from her position and be banned from serving on future HOA boards. If these conditions weren't met, I said I'd be filing both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit against both the president personally and the HOA as an organization. The room erupted after I finished speaking. Several neighbors started applauding, while others were asking questions about their own properties and what kind of investigations had been done. The president was shouting that I was trying to intimidate the board and that she'd done nothing wrong. She said the HOA had every right to investigate violations and that homeowners who didn't want oversight shouldn't buy in communities with HOAs. But by this point, the other board members were clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. They called for a recess and said they needed to discuss the matter privately. The meeting reconvened about 20 minutes later. The board announced that they would need time to review the evidence I'd presented and consult with their attorney before making any decisions. They said I'd receive a written response within 7 business days. As everyone was leaving, several neighbors came up to me to ask about what I'd presented. A few of them said they'd noticed unusual activity around their own properties recently and were wondering if they'd been investigated too. One neighbor mentioned that she'd found footprints in her backyard a few weeks earlier, but had assumed it was just kids cutting through the neighborhood. Another said his security camera had triggered a few times recently, but he hadn't bothered to check the footage. I suggested they might want to review their own camera footage and keep an eye out for any unusual activity. The next few days were pretty tense. My wife and I were both wondering if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. The president still had allies on the board, and we weren't sure which way this would go. But exactly 7 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. The letter stated that after reviewing the evidence and consulting with legal counsel, the board had reached several decisions. First, all violations against my property were being dropped immediately, and any associated fines were waived. Second, the board was authorizing the installation of a privacy fence along my back property line at HOA expense, as requested. Third, the board was adopting new policies requiring all evidence collection to be done from publicly accessible areas only. And most importantly, the president had submitted her resignation from the board, effective immediately. The letter stated that she was also banned from serving on the HOA board in the future. The letter didn't admit any wrongdoing, but it gave me everything I'd asked for. I have to admit, I was pretty shocked that they'd agreed to everything. I'd expected at least some pushback or negotiation, but apparently their attorney had explained just how serious the legal liability was. Criminal trespassing charges against a board member acting in an official capacity could open the HOA up to massive civil liability. Every homeowner whose property she'd investigated could potentially file suit. The cost of settling with me was nothing compared to the potential lawsuits from dozens of other homeowners. Within 2 weeks, contractors were out installing a beautiful 6-foot privacy fence along my entire back property line. They used cedar posts and boards matching the raised beds in my garden. The new board president, who turned out to be the older guy who'd asked the hard questions during the meeting, stopped by while the fence was being installed. He apologized for what had happened and assured me that the board was committed to more professional and legal oversight going forward. He also mentioned that they'd received several complaints from other neighbors about potential trespassing on their properties, and that they were reviewing all violation cases from the past year to make sure they'd been handled properly. A few weeks later, my wife and I were in the backyard working in the garden when we heard someone talking loudly near the fence. We walked over to see what was going on. The former president was standing just outside our new fence with what looked like binoculars trying to peer over into our yard. She was talking to herself about how she couldn't see if we were maintaining the garden properly. My wife and I looked at each other and just started laughing. Here was this woman who'd lost her position and been banned from the board, still obsessing over our perfectly legal vegetables. I walked over to the fence where she was standing and politely said hello. She immediately got defensive and said she was standing on a public sidewalk and had every right to be there. I told her she was absolutely correct, but that I wanted her to know that our new security cameras had a perfect view of the fence line and would record anyone who tried to climb over. She huffed and walked away, but not before I heard her muttering something about how the neighborhood was going downhill. That was about 6 months ago, and things have been peaceful since then. We've expanded our garden even more, added a small greenhouse, and are really enjoying our private backyard space. The new board has been much more reasonable to deal with. They actually sent out a survey asking homeowners what they thought the HOA's priorities should be, which was a nice change from the previous administration's approach. I still see the former president around the neighborhood sometimes, usually walking her dog past houses and staring intently at people's yards. But our new fence keeps her from seeing anything worth complaining about. The whole experience taught me a lot about standing up for yourself and the importance of documentation. If I hadn't been able to prove what she was doing, this could have gone very differently. It also made me realize how many HOAs probably have similar problems with board members who think their authority extends beyond what's actually legal or appropriate. Since our case, I've heard from several neighbors about suspicious activity around their properties that they now realize was probably the former president conducting her investigations. One neighbor found that someone had been moving around planters on his patio to get better photos of his air conditioning unit, which had apparently been cited for being too visible from the street. Another discovered that someone had been regularly checking whether his trash cans were properly stored by actually entering his garage through an unlocked side door. All of these activities stopped after the former president resigned, which confirmed that she'd been conducting a much more extensive surveillance operation than just what happened on my property. The new board has been working to rebuild trust with homeowners by being more transparent about their processes and making sure all investigations are conducted properly. They've also implemented a new policy requiring board members to complete training on legal and ethical oversight before taking on any enforcement responsibilities. But the best part of this whole story is something that happened just last week. I was working in my garden when I noticed someone walking back and forth on the sidewalk behind our fence. Through the slats, I could see it was the former president again, this time with what looked like a professional-grade camera with a long telephoto lens. She was clearly trying to find some angle to photograph our backyard, probably hoping to find new violations she could report to the current board. So I did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. I walked over to where I keep our trail cameras and very obviously activated the one that has a clear view of the fence line. Then I called out loudly enough for her to hear that our security system was now recording and asked my wife to make sure the motion sensors were working properly. Within about 30 seconds, I heard her footsteps hurrying away down the sidewalk. I checked the camera footage later, and sure enough, she'd been out there for almost an hour trying different positions and angles with her camera before I'd interrupted her. The recording clearly shows her with professional photography equipment, clearly attempting to take photos of our property from every possible angle along the public sidewalk. I'm keeping the footage just in case she escalates her behavior again, but for now I'm just amused by her persistence. My wife thinks I should feel bad for her, since she clearly misses being in control of neighborhood oversight. But I figure anyone who's willing to trespass on private property and try door handles probably deserves whatever social consequences come from that behavior. The whole experience has actually brought our neighborhood closer together in some ways. Several neighbors have started an informal group chat where we share information about HOA activities and make sure everyone knows their rights. We've also been more social with our immediate neighbors, which has been really nice. It turns out a lot of people were intimidated by the former president's aggressive enforcement style and are relieved to have a more reasonable board in place. Our new fence has been great too. The contractor did beautiful work, and it's given us complete privacy to enjoy our backyard without worrying about surprise inspections or unauthorized photography. We've even added some fruit trees along the fence line, which would have definitely triggered violation notices under the previous administration, but which the current board approved without any issues. Last month, the new board president asked if I'd be interested in serving on the Architectural Review Committee, since I'd demonstrated good research skills and attention to legal details during my case. I'm still thinking about it. Part of me wants to help make sure other homeowners don't go through what we experienced, but another part of me just wants to tend my garden and stay out of HOA politics. For now, I'm just enjoying my expanded vegetable garden and the knowledge that no one can climb over my fence to photograph my tomatoes without getting caught on camera. Sometimes I see the former president walking by with her dog, and she always slows down when she passes our fence, like she's listening for sounds from our backyard or hoping to catch a glimpse of some new violation. But all she can see now is 6 feet of beautiful cedar fencing and whatever plants we choose to grow along the public side. And honestly, that's exactly how it should be. This whole experience taught me that sometimes standing up to bullies requires patience, preparation, and documentation, but that it's worth doing when someone is clearly overstepping their authority. I'm just glad I had the technical background to recognize what was happening with those photos, because without that evidence, this could have been just my word against hers about the trespassing. If there's any lesson from this story, it's that homeowners should know their rights and not assume that HOA board members have unlimited authority to investigate their property, and maybe invest in some trail cameras because you never know when you might need to document someone's behavior for legal purposes. The vegetable garden is doing great this year, by the way. We've got more tomatoes than we know what to do with, and the herbs are growing beautifully in their new raised bed. Best of all, we can enjoy them all in complete privacy, knowing that anyone who wants to photograph our yard will have to do it from the public sidewalk like everyone else. Sometimes when I'm out watering the plants, I think about how this all started with one suspicious violation notice and some photos that didn't make sense. It just goes to show how important it is to pay attention to details and trust your instincts when something doesn't seem right. I never would have expected to become the neighborhood expert on property rights and HOA governance, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns. And sometimes those turns work out better than you could have hoped for, especially when you've got good documentation and a clear understanding of the law on your side. The former president still lives in the neighborhood, and I occasionally run into her at the grocery store or community events. She's always polite but cold, like she knows I'm the one who ended her reign of terror but can't quite bring herself to admit she was wrong. That's fine with me. I never wanted to be enemies with anyone, but I also wasn't going to let her trespass on my property and harass me with bogus violations. The new board has been so much better to work with. They actually seem interested in what homeowners think and want, rather than just finding ways to cite people for violations. They've also been much more reasonable about things like gardens and outdoor improvements, recognizing that people want to enjoy their property rather than just maintain it to some arbitrary standard. Our neighborhood feels more like a community now rather than a place where everyone's afraid of getting in trouble with the HOA board. And my wife and I have a beautiful private backyard where we can grow whatever vegetables we want without worrying about surprise inspections. All in all, I'd say this story had a pretty good ending, even though it was stressful while it was happening. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, and sometimes you win. Anyway, thank you for watching.